have your introduction, you're going to want that. This is what we're going to be going through this morning as I introduce the Book of Esther to us. So the first thing you're going to see on that page is the crux of the book, the most famous verse in the whole book. I'm going to read it for you right now. It is what Mordecai says to Esther in chapter 4. He says, "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." I bet each and every one of us has seen a coffee mug or a t-shirt that says "such a time as this" on it at some point. But really, the whole point of the book of Esther is that God delivers his people regardless of the fact of whether human beings are obedient or not. And that's what we're going to see in this book. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to look at three main things this morning. First, we're going to talk about the Persian Empire. Where are we in the Bible? Number one, we left the book of Ruth. Now we're in the book of Esther. There is a lot of things that have happened between those two times. So we're going to go over that and kind of get our heads around what was the Persian Empire like. Then we're going to look at the main characters of Esther. There's 4 that we're going to look at. And then the last thing we're going to look at are the literary features of the book. So each and every book in the Bible is written with certain things that will help us understand the book more. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with the time of the Persian Empire. Don't you love this tile mosaic here? This is from the palace of King Darius in Susa. So Esther would have seen these archers in her time. Is that crazy? All right, so I want to start us off by thinking about where are we at in the Old Testament. So I have this printed out on a sheet of paper so you can see it a little bit better. But I wanted to walk us through what is the point of the Old Testament, right? All of the Old Testament is pointing us towards the cross. It's telling us the whole story of how Jesus sent a Savior to save his people from their sins. And each and every book in the Old Testament moves us closer and closer and closer to that event. So we just were in the book of Ruth. So we would have been in the time of the judges right here. And the time of Esther is way over here. And the return and the restoration. So we can think, if we think about the book of Ruth, how did we end the book of Ruth? There was a family tree. And who was mentioned in that family tree? Anybody remember? King David, yes. So we moved out of the time of the judges, right? And we said, everyone did what was right in their sight of their own eyes, right? They did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And they went through the sin cycle over and over and over. I'm reading through the book of Judges right now. It's so depressing. It's so depressing. The people are good for a little while and then they mess up. Well, finally, when we move into the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel in the time of the kings right here, we can see the people cry out for a king. They reject God's governance. They say, we want a king to rule over us. So first there's Saul, and then after Saul comes God's choice of king, which is David, right? And then David reigns, and then his sons reign for a while. But something happens, right? After David is king, he passes away. His son Solomon becomes king. Solomon's a pretty good king. He builds the temple. But then something happens at the end of his life. Does anybody remember what it is? He messes up. Anybody remember? So Solomon married foreign wives, right? And the foreign wives bring idols into the kingdom of Israel. And if you read, as I am this year, reading from Genesis through Judges and all of the books in the Old Testament, there's one thing that God really super cares about. Don't worship idols. And Solomon does it. So after this happens, we can see that the kingdom, this promised kingdom, this king, is not quite what it's supposed to be. He starts to mess up. And then as Solomon's son take over the kingship, it gets worse and worse and worse and worse, right? Until finally we have this split, this division in Israel, right? The northern kingdom is called Israel. They have their own, they separate, right? They go and they have their own worship in the northern part. And then the southern part is Judah. Right? That's where Jerusalem is. We have the split. Well, like I said, things get worse and worse and worse with idol worship. And God starts to send the prophets to the people, and he warns them, and he says, stop what you're doing, turn back to God, or else I'm going to send you in exile to foreign lands. And so this goes on for a while, and then finally the northern kingdom falls, and then shortly after that, the southern kingdom falls, and all of Israel goes into exile. Except for that tiny little remnant that's left behind. So after the exile, the people are in exile for a while, and now here we are in the time of Esther. This is the time of restoration. So the books of Ezra and Nehemiah have already taken place. The people have been allowed to return to the land. They've rebuilt the temple. And now we're going to pick up the book of Esther from here. Okay. Did I lose anybody? Okay. All right, so now we get to talk about the Persian Empire. I had a lot of fun researching this. I found out a lot of fun facts about it, so this is going to take us to the first part of our little fill in the blank here. So here's what you need to know about the Persian Empire. First of all, they're descended from nomadic peoples. They grew up on horses. One podcast that I listened to said, think about the Mongols, how their children were born, and then they were basically on horseback moving from place to place. This is what the Persians were like as well. And here's the most fun fact that I loved hearing when I was researching this, is that the Persians were the first people to wear long pants that covered your entire leg. And the reason why, and you can kind of see, I don't know if you can see it in this thing, can you see the hem of his pant leg right there? They were the first to wear pants that covered the whole leg because they were on horseback so much they would get saddle sores. And one of the podcasts that I listened to said when the Greeks saw the Persians and they saw that they had trousers that went all the way down and they had these long sleeves that went all the way down, they were horrified because they're used to like nudity, like things like that. And they were like, what? Why are they covering themselves up? But I thought that was a really fun fact. They were the first people to wear trousers. If you were to go and Google the Persian Empire, I guarantee you this word will come up. I know there are people that do not like churchy words. They do not like big words, but I need to tell you that the Persian Empire is actually not called the Persian Empire. It's called the Achaemenid Empire. And it is established by Cyrus the Great in 550 BC. Now, here's me. I'm trying to figure out, well, who were the Persians, right? Because we hear about the Babylonians, and the Babylonians seem like they're right next door to the Persians. I was trying to figure out, like, what is the difference between these people? Well, here's what I found out. Persians are actually one of quite a few clans that lived in what we would consider modern-day Iran today. And some of those famous clans were the Medes, the Persians, the Elamites, the Parthians. We might remember this one. Parthians and Scythians were actually there on the day of Pentecost in the book of Acts. But these are some of the most well-known clans. So the Persians are one of these clans, these nomadic tribes that came out of Iran. Now, at its peak, the Persian Empire contained 2.1 million square miles. It was the biggest empire that had ever been up until that time. So it went from, this is India, modern day India right here, and went all the way up into like the Eurasian mountains, up in the Caucasus, over here to the Balkans, way over here, this is Greece. And then way down here is Jerusalem. We see part of like the Saudi Arabia peninsula, and then like Egypt all the way to Libya. Huge, huge empire. So here's our question. How did the Jews end up in Susa? Well, we talked about the exile that happened and the events that happened to the northern tribe of Israel. So this always gets confusing to me because I tend to think of the people of Israel as one people. So we have to think of the northern kingdom as Israel. So the northern tribes of Israel were taken into captivity, as we said, by the Assyrians. And the southern tribe of Judah are taken into captivity a little later on by the Babylonians. Well, the ones that are captured from the north, from the northern part of Israel, are forced to resettle around Media and Susa by Sargon II. I love that name. It sounds like something you'd clean your house with, Sargon II. Yeah, or a spice, yes. I need a pinch of Sargon in my stew. All of this happened, so this is how the Jews end up around Susa. So this is probably how Mordecai and his family ended up there. And then 538 BC, the first king of the Persian Empire, King Cyrus, issues an edict that releases all the Jews in Babylon and around Susa and all in his kingdom. They are allowed to return to the promised land. Now, this picture right here, this like weird tablet thing, has cuneiform on it. This is actually the proclamation from the king that released the Jewish people back to Israel. It still exists. That's pretty crazy. So my natural question was, okay, I understand how they ended up in Susa, but why did Mordecai and Esther go back? Why didn't they go back? Because, I don't know, just quick, I think I asked you guys this in your discussion group questions. Who would want to go back just to Jerusalem? Who would want to be in charge of rebuilding the walls and teaching the people the word? Only one person? Okay. All right. And then some of you might be like, that sounds like a lot. I think I'll wait it out and see how it goes before I go. So here's something to mention. This book takes place 50 years since they're released to go back to the land. And it happens only 32 years after the temple's completed. So it's still kind of a dicey time going on right there. So why didn't they return? Well, comfortable exile. That's our answer here. Many Jews do choose to go back to Jerusalem, but a lot of Jews decided to remain in the relative stability of Persia rather than face the difficulty, the dangerous and demanding work of rebuilding Jerusalem. And Mordecai, we can read in Esther, we know that he held an important position in the Persian court. He was a part of civic life there. He wasn't ready to return yet. But why else didn't they return? This was the other thing that I found. Well, it was God's purpose. God uses Esther's position in Susa as queen to protect his people across a vast empire. So when we think about this, I want you to keep this in mind as you read. When Esther goes to the king and pleads for the Jewish people, she is not just pleading for the Jews that are in Susa, which is right here. She's pleading on behalf of all the Jewish people from here to here. All of them. The entire Jewish nation. We're talking like a Holocaust situation. Okay. Esther Susa. So I kind of just said it. The book takes place in the citadel of Susa. There is a lot of neat archaeological things that are still around. This pillar right here with the two, I don't know what they are, cows? I think they're cows. Look how big this is. Like, this would be like an average sized person would be about this tall. This is huge. This would have been at the very top holding up the palace. So all of these columns would have been like in a row holding the palace up there. So this is from the palace that Esther lived in. This book begins in the 3rd year of King, I know you want to know how to say it, Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus. I've also heard Ahasuerus. It takes place in the king's reign in 483 BC. Already mentioned the palace. Oh, here's something to mention about this palace. Susa, if I go back here, you can kind of see it in this picture. The palace in Susa was built on top of this. So it would have been up here, would have been the palace. The palace is constructed at 50, all right, wait, I'm going to say this wrong. Susa, the city, was on a flat plain, and the palace was constructed on a huge mountain like we just saw, about 15 meters or 50 feet higher than the rest of the city. So when we get to the point where we have the gallows that are getting ready to be built by Haman. Wait, I lost my slide. Where was it? There it is. When we get to the point where Haman's ready to build his gallows, he wants to be able to see the gallows from a window in the palace. So that's why he constructs these huge gallows that are like 75 feet high. It's because his house, where he's constructing these gallows, is actually lower than where the palace is. He wants to be able to see the gallows from the windows in the palace. So that's something to keep in mind. I found that really interesting. Okay. Next thing we need to know about the Persian court, and this is definitely on display as we go through, is that the Persian court is incredibly wealthy. A lot of the gold that was in the Persian court still exists today. In the very first chapter, chapter 1, you guys are going to see this as you do your homework next week. In the very first chapter, they talk about this lavish banquet that the king puts on, and he talks about golden vessels that they're drinking out of. Well, guess what? These are 2 golden vessels, drinking vessels. This is a gold Rhyton, which is in the British Museum. This dates from the time of Esther. So they would have been drinking out of these beautiful golden things. Throughout the book of Esther, we're going to see an emphasis on outward beauty. So like this superficial, the beauty that we can see. Whereas, you remember in Ruth, we were talking a lot about like inner beauty, like the inner beauty that's beautiful to God. This is a lot about outward beauty as we go through Esther. Another word we're going to come across as we go through, a satrap. So what the heck is a satrap? Well, satrap was a governor or like a regent of a province in the Persian Empire. They acted in the place of the king in like the far-flung places of this empire. Remember, we said it's 2.1 million square miles. So the satraps kind of rule in the king's place all over the empire. And actually, you can see here, this is how many satrapies there were. This is all the satraps. When you get to that word in Esther, this is what they're talking about. It's like a governor, like almost like the 50 states of America. We all have a governor that kind of rules our territory, even though we still have a president. That's kind of what's going on here. These are people that govern these specific places in the Persian Empire. Okay. What's a eunuch? This is a word we don't use very much, but I wanted to bring this up because most of us probably know what a eunuch is, but they had a very unique and special role. So I wanted to make sure I mention this. So this is actually a picture of a eunuch from the Persian Empire. This dates from before Esther, but eunuchs had a very special role within the court. So eunuch is a castrated male servant of the king. From what I read and listened to, these eunuchs were usually castrated as boys. So they would have had higher voices. They would have had bodies that don't look very manly. But some of them willingly became eunuchs as men. So some look like men. But they held a really important and influential role in the court in that they could be messengers to the very hearts of every part of the royal palace. I'm trying to think of a sensitive way to say this. Because they had been castrated, it was thought that they could safely go into a female court to the very heart of everything that was happening and being said there without there being any danger to those women. However, because they were castrated, they also kind of had a male role where they would go into the very hearts of the very male parts of the court. So they're very important in that they have influence to both sides of the court. and they became very influential advisors to the king. And we're going to see that as we go through. You can see I put all of the mentions of the word eunuch in Esther. There's a lot. They're incredibly influential in the king's court. Next thing to mention, harems. I'm going to talk about this in a minute. Sex is mentioned a lot in Esther. There's no way to sugarcoat this. Esther 2 describes the king's harem. Now, the king would have had many wives and many concubines. There was no monogamy in the Persian court. We're going to see after the king rejects Vashti in chapter 1, we're going to see this. A lot of places say beauty contest. The books that I read actually say it's almost like a sex contest as well. So the purpose of the harem is for the king's pleasure, but it's also to produce as many heirs as possible. I found this really surprising. One podcast that I listened to said that harems were interesting places, and the Persian court was an interesting place because we're so used to, especially in the Bible, we see the right of the firstborn to inherit everything. We see it today, like in the British Empire, we can see that the firstborn heir is the one that inherits everything. Well, that's not the way that it was in the Persian Empire. The way that this one guy, it was a professor from Wales, he was saying that in the Persian Empire, it basically was the king's most favorite and the one that had the most kingly qualities that became the heir, if you weren't assassinated first. Extra biblical sources let us know that King Ahasuerus, or Ahasuerus, was actually assassinated by one of his sons. So, you can see why in the harem, okay, they said actually these harems would have been places with lots of women, but there would have been a lot of children running around. And so this was a way for a woman. They said a lot of times the women that were in the harems were slaves from other conquered parts of the empire. But it was a way that even if you were in this harem as a slave, the most influential role that you could have as a woman in the Persian court was the mother of the king. So it was a way of going from lowly slave in the harem all the way to the most important women in the empire. So we're going to see the harem as we go through Esther. All right, now we get to get into the characters. So we said it, there's two names here. So if you have the NIV, your Bible probably says King Xerxes. If you're reading the ESV, it definitely says King Ahasuerus or Ahasuerus. So why the two names? Why did the ESV choose to do this? Why don't they just say Xerxes? If you were to look it up online, most people, all of them, extra biblical sources call him Xerxes the First. Why do we say Ahasuerus? Well, Ahasuerus comes from the Hebrew word Ahashverosh. Ahashverosh. So that's why the ESV chose the name Ahasuerus to keep it closer to the original Hebrew. Xerxes, and I love this the Persian version. Xerxes is the Persian version. That is his Persian name would have been Xerxes, which is why most people call him Xerxes, the Persian version. Some things to know about the king. This actually is the king. This actually is Xerxes the First sitting on his throne. The king is very powerful. He is susceptible to influence. One podcast I listened to said, why can't this guy make a decision on his own? He literally seeks advice just about before everything he does. Just about. There might be one or two exceptions. He seeks advice before acting on anything. He never decides on his own, which opens the door for Esther to become an influence, right? Esther. This is not Esther. This is Queen Hadassah, not Hadassah, Adassa, which was a different queen. This would have been Xerxes' mother, or Ahasuerus' mother. That is her actual image. And then this does portray a queen. There would have been probably multiple queens in the Persian Empire. So Esther has two names as well. Esther is the Persian version of her name. And Hadassah, we're told, is her Hebrew name. Now, this is an important character feature for Esther as we go through the whole book. We're going to see Esther grappling with these two identities. Is she a Persian queen? Or is she a Hebrew woman in covenant relationship with God? We're going to see her struggle with that, especially in chapter 4. And that crucial verse that I read for us at the beginning, that is a turning point for Esther's character. We'll get to that in just a minute. Esther's big role throughout the book is as mediator for her people to the king. Okay. Next one to mention, Mordecai. Yeah, I love Mordecai. Mordecai. This is the important thing we need to know about him. This is in Esther chapter 2, verse 5. It's told to us that Mordecai is the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. That is super important to understanding the Book of Esther. You're going to get to that in your homework. So I'm not going to jump ahead too much, but believe me when I say son of Kish is very important to this book. So keep an eye out for that in your homework this week. All right, character features. Mordecai is unapologetically a part of God's covenant people. He is not going to bow down to Haman, and he is unashamed to be Jewish. Mordecai, his big role in the Book of Esther is as the righteous man. Okay, and our last character for the Book of Esther, Haman. Now, we're also told something very important about Haman. Haman is an Agagite, the son of Hammedatha. Agagite is incredibly important to the story. So I'm just going to leave it there. I'm going to let you guys do the work on that one. But look at those two things about them. What does the Bible tell us about Agagites and Agag, King Agag? What does it tell us about the son of Kish? Haman is if the book has a villain, this guy's it. Haman is the enemy of God's covenant people. He hates them. He has enmity for them that goes back centuries, okay? He has a deep hatred for Mordecai and for the people of God. And we're even shown in chapter 3, his edict that's going to go out is to destroy, kill, and annihilate the Jewish people without any exception. Women, children, anything. Okay, Haman. So that's his big role in Esther, is he's the bad guy. All right, we're going to go quickly through some literary features. Literary features of Esther. Okay, first, the thing that's going to be on display throughout the whole book is that God is going to deliver his people. Esther tells a story of survival of God's covenant people, the Jews. Remember, God made a covenant with Abraham, with all of Abraham's sons, that he would make them a great nation and that he would bring a Messiah to them through this nation. So this is the story of the survival of God's covenant people from extinction. God delivers his people. And in doing so, he's preserving the line of the Messiah that's going to come. Though he's not explicitly mentioned, God sovereignly rules the course of history, moving us toward the cross. Okay. I just said it. Here's a very important feature of Esther. Where is God? We need to be very careful to note that God is never mentioned by name in Esther. There is no explicit mention of any of the great acts that God did for Moses, for the people in Egypt, for Abraham. All of those things are never mentioned. There is no word from God, and there are no words spoken to God. This is not a sign that God is uninvolved. On the contrary, one source that I read said it doesn't actually tell us something about God. It tells us something about the people that were living during this time. It's a sign that the spiritual condition of the people was poor. If we were to flip in our Bibles to the book of Esther, we would know that the returning exiles came back worldly and ignorant of God's word. Do you remember this? Ezra comes and he reads God's word to the people, and they weep. They weep for what they didn't know about God and his ways. So this is more telling us about the spiritual ignorance of Israel at this time. They have forgotten a lot about God. And we can see when they return to Jerusalem, they're mimicking the same sins that exiled them in the first place. So they got a lot of straightening out to do. So that's part of the reason why we don't read a lot about God in this book. However, God's hand is on display if we're careful to watch for it. Esther speaks to God's covenant faithfulness to his people. God keeps his promises by preserving and protecting his people even when they've forgotten his word and his ways. Okay, author and audience. They're not named in the book. From what I read, we can take this as a contemporary account, which I think is very cool. One of the podcasts that I listened to, I mentioned it a few times already. It was with a professor who spends his whole life studying the Persian Empire. One of the best resources they have on the Persian Empire is the Book of Esther. So likely this book is a contemporary account, which accounts for what happened in the Persian Empire because of Esther. And it's written for the benefit of the people who are returning back to the land of Israel. It's written to give encouragement to them that God is still working on their behalf. Okay. Another important feature of Esther is darkness. If you guys remember when we did the intro to Ruth, I showed you a picture of a bright diamond on the screen against a black background. There is no diamond this time. Ruth is pure and light, but Esther is equally as dark and corrupt. I already said it, but sex and violence, we are going to see, are woven throughout the book of Esther. We're going to see an emphasis on the superficial, on superficial beauty rather than inner beauty. We're going to see murderous hatred of God's people. And then the whole book ends in chapter 9 with these violent killings. So there's a lot of darkness going on in the book of Esther. Okay? Two last things to mention. The book of Esther features dramatic reversals brought about by God's hand or divine providence. Does everybody know what I mean when I say providence? Think of the root word there, which is provide. This is God providing for his people in ways. So dramatic reversals are a part of that. So some examples we're going to see are Queen Vashti and then Queen Esther. We're going to see that reversal. We're going to see Haman fall and Mordecai rise. We're going to see the first edict that goes out for Haman, that's destroy all the Jewish people. And then we're going to see this new edict that's allowing them to defend themselves. And then we're going to see this contrast between fasting and mourning because of the one edict. And then we're going to see feasting and joy at the end of the book in chapter 9 and 10. And then the last thing to mention, time. So chapters 1 through 4 in Esther cover a 9-year period. So we're going to have this incredibly fast moving sequence of events in the first 4 chapters. We can see that in chapter 1, verse 3, we're told it's the 3rd year of the reign. In chapter 2, verse 16, we're told it's the 7th year of the reign. And then by chapter 3, we're told that Haman's plot occurs in the 12th year of the reign. So we have this really fast-moving set of events at first, and then all of a sudden, it's like someone hits the brake. It's like an hourglass, right? It kind of narrows in on this one time. And chapters 5 through 7 slow down and cover only 2 days. Now, to be sure, this is a literary device that is telling us this is important. Pay attention to chapters 5 through 7. These are the important chapters of the book. It's all important, but this is where the important action is going to happen. And then we're going to see everything pick up and speed up again in chapters 8 through 10. All right, we did it. We made it through the introduction.